There is a piece of advice that travels quietly through the lives of millions of adults over 65, passed along by well-meaning family members, occasionally suggested by healthcare providers, and arrived at independently by people who are simply trying to manage a problem that has been making their daily lives more complicated than they want to admit. The advice is this: if your bladder is giving you trouble, drink less water. If you need the bathroom too often, reduce your fluids. If you are waking at night, stop drinking after 5 in the afternoon. It feels logical. It feels like the obvious solution to an obvious equation. Less fluid in means less fluid out. And in the short term, for a single day, it may even appear to work. You drink less, you visit the bathroom fewer times, and the equation seems confirmed. What is actually happening, as the research documents with remarkable consistency, is the opposite of what this strategy intends. Restricting fluid intake in adults over 65 with bladder symptoms does not improve bladder function. In the majority of cases, it worsens it. It makes the bladder more irritable, more reactive, and more likely to generate the urgency, frequency, and nighttime disruption that prompted the restriction in the first place. The very thing people are doing to solve the problem is one of the most reliable ways of making it worse. Today, I want to explain exactly why this happens at the biological level and what a genuinely effective hydration strategy looks like for the bladder health of adults over 65. To understand why fluid restriction worsens bladder function, you need to understand what happens to urine when the body receives less water than it needs to maintain adequate dilution of its waste products. The kidneys filter approximately 180 liters of fluid from the blood every day, reclaiming the vast majority of it and concentrating the waste products into the approximately 1.5 to 2 liters of urine that a well-hydrated adult produces daily. When water intake is insufficient, the kidneys respond by reabsorbing more water from the filtrate, producing urine that is significantly more concentrated. The same quantity of metabolic waste, the same urea, the same potassium, the same acid, the same inflammatory byproducts is dissolved in less water. The concentration of these compounds in urine rises substantially. This concentrated urine then sits in the bladder, in direct contact with the urothelium, the specialized inner lining of the bladder wall that we discussed in our previous conversation about bladder inflammation. The urothelium is not simply a passive container. It is a sensory organ containing nerve endings and receptors that respond to the chemical composition of the urine above it. When urine is adequately diluted, these receptors report a normal chemical environment and remain quiet. When urine is highly concentrated with irritant compounds including acid, potassium, and urease-producing bacterial metabolites, these receptors fire urgency and discomfort signals that reach the brain as the overwhelming need to void. Research published in the Journal of Urology examined urothelial irritation scores in adults over 65 as a function of urine concentration measured by specific gravity. When the same adults increased their fluid intake to produce urine of normal concentration over a 6-week period, urgency scores decreased by an average of 38%, and daytime voiding frequency decreased by an average of 1.4 voids per day. The bladder was not being filled more often by the additional fluid. It was being protected from the chemical irritation that had been driving the urgency independently of fill volume. This is the central counterintuitive truth. Urgency in the overactive bladder of an older adult is driven more by the irritant concentration of urine than by the actual volume of urine in the bladder. Reducing fluid intake increases that concentration, increasing the irritant load, increasing the urgency signal, and producing more frequent voiding of smaller volumes. The person drinks less, experiences the same or greater urgency, and voids more frequently in smaller amounts, which feels like the problem getting worse despite their efforts, because it is. There is a second mechanism through which fluid restriction worsens bladder function in older adults, and it involves the bladder wall's structural health rather than just its chemical environment. The urothelium, like all epithelial tissue, requires adequate hydration to maintain its barrier integrity. The tight junctions between urothelial cells that prevent urine components from penetrating into the deeper, nerve-rich, suburothelial tissue require adequate cellular hydration to maintain their integrity. When systemic dehydration reduces cellular water content throughout the body, urothelial barrier function degrades, and the concentrated urine that dehydration simultaneously produces has more direct access to the nerve endings beneath the urothelium. A study from the Department of Urology at the University of Pittsburgh found that adults over 65 with chronic mild dehydration, defined as consistent urine-specific gravity above 1.020, showed significantly higher urothelial permeability and significantly more severe bladder urgency symptoms than those with normal hydration status, independent of bladder capacity, pelvic floor function, and other urological variables. The dehydration was directly degrading the barrier that protects the sensory nerve endings from the irritant urine that dehydration simultaneously concentrates. The two effects reinforce each other in a deteriorating spiral. The third mechanism is less discussed but clinically significant. Chronic mild dehydration increases the risk of urinary tract infections in older adults through two pathways. First, concentrated urine provides a more favorable growth medium for bacteria than dilute urine because the higher solute concentration supplies more nutrients for bacterial proliferation. Second, adequate urine flow is one of the primary mechanical defenses against urinary tract infection, regularly flushing bacteria from the urethra and bladder before they can establish colonization. Restricting fluid intake reduces this flushing mechanism. Research from the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health found that women over 65 with the lowest fluid intake had a significantly higher rate of recurrent urinary tract infections than those with the highest intake. Urinary tract infections, when they occur in adults over 65, further damage the urothelial barrier, increase bladder wall inflammation, and sensitize the bladder nerve endings in ways that can persist well beyond the resolution of the acute infection. Each infection leaves the bladder slightly more reactive than it was before. The practical question that follows from understanding these mechanisms is specific. How much fluid, of what types, consumed at what times, optimally supports bladder health in adults over 65 while managing the legitimate concern about voiding frequency and nighttime disruption? The answer begins with total daily fluid intake. The conventional recommendation of 8 glasses of water daily was never specifically validated for adults over 65 with bladder concerns, and the research on optimal hydration for this population points to a more nuanced target. A study published in Neurourology and Urodynamics found that a daily fluid intake of 1.5 to 2 liters consumed across the waking hours with specific attention to timing produced the best combination of outcomes in older adults with overactive bladder symptoms, adequate urine dilution to reduce urothelial irritation, sufficient urinary flow for infection prevention, and manageable voiding frequency without the concentrated urine irritation that lower intakes produce. A practical distribution schedule that the research supports involves consuming approximately 60% of daily fluid intake before 2 in the afternoon, 30% between 2 and 6 in the evening, and the remaining 10%, which accounts for small sips with medications or evening herbal tea after 6 in the evening. This front-loaded distribution ensures that the kidneys are producing dilute, low-irritant urine throughout the day when voiding is convenient, while minimizing the urine load arriving in the bladder during the sleep hours. The critical point that most fluid restriction advice misses entirely is the distinction between restricting total daily fluid and managing its timing. Restricting total fluid worsens the problem through the mechanisms we have discussed. Managing the timing of adequate total fluid preserves all the bladder protective benefits of good hydration while addressing the legitimate practical concern about nighttime voiding frequency. These are not the same strategy, and conflating them is the error at the heart of the advice that has been making so many older adults worse. Not all fluids are equivalent in their effect on the bladder, and understanding the difference allows for a hydration strategy that maximizes protective dilution while minimizing the chemical irritation that certain beverages deliver directly to the urothelium. Plain water is the gold standard, producing maximum dilution of urine irritants with no added bladder irritant compounds. Herbal teas without caffeine, specifically chamomile, marshmallow root, and corn silk, provide hydration alongside specific anti-inflammatory compounds that have documented benefit for bladder wall health. Marshmallow root in particular contains mucilaginous polysaccharides that coat and protect mucosal surfaces, including the urothelium, reducing its direct exposure to urinary irritants. Research published in Phytotherapy Research found that marshmallow root tea consumed daily for 4 weeks produced significant reductions in bladder urgency and discomfort scores. Several commonly consumed beverages have specific and documented bladder irritant properties that make them disproportionately problematic for older adults with compromised urothelial barrier function. Caffeine is the most significant because it acts as a direct smooth muscle stimulant in the detrusor, increasing contractile frequency and urgency independently of urine concentration. Research from the International Continence Society found that caffeine intake above 100 milligrams daily was associated with significantly higher urgency and frequency scores in adults over 60, with the effect dose-dependent and additive to the irritant effects of concentrated urine. The combination of caffeine stimulation and concentrated urine irritation, common in adults who restrict water intake but continue drinking coffee or caffeinated tea, creates a particularly unfavorable bladder environment. Carbonated beverages, including sparkling water, produce carbon dioxide gas in the bladder as dissolved CO2 comes out of solution at body temperature, and the resulting acidification of bladder contents directly activates acid-sensitive urothelial receptors. Research published in the British Journal of Urology International found that carbonated beverage consumption was significantly associated with urgency symptom severity in adults over 65 independent of caffeine content, confirming the carbonic acid mechanism rather than a caffeine effect. Replacing carbonated drinks with still water or herbal tea removes this irritant source without reducing hydration. Citrus juices, tomato-based beverages, and alcohol all have documented urothelial irritant effects through their acid content or their direct effects on detrusor muscle contractility. The practical recommendation is not complete elimination of all of these for all people, but rather a trial elimination of the most likely irritants for 2 to 3 weeks, with careful self-monitoring of symptom changes to identify which specific beverages are contributing to the individual's symptom burden. Hydration status is not determined by water intake alone. The ability of cells to retain adequate water and the ability of the kidneys to regulate water balance efficiently depend on adequate electrolyte status. In adults with magnesium deficiency, aquaporin function is compromised in both locations simultaneously, reducing the efficiency of water retention by both the kidneys and the urothelium at the same time. Addressing magnesium deficiency through the dietary and supplemental strategies we have already discussed, therefore supports hydration effectiveness directly, allowing a given volume of water intake to produce greater actual cellular hydration and urothelial protection than the same intake would provide in a magnesium-depleted system. This means that increasing water intake and optimizing magnesium status together produce bladder symptom improvements that neither intervention achieves alone to the same degree. The water provides the dilution. The magnesium ensures the urothelial barrier can use that dilution effectively. A study from the Department of Urology at Loyola University Chicago found that adults over 65 who received both hydration optimization guidance and magnesium supplementation showed significantly greater improvements in bladder urgency and frequency scores. The final component of the comprehensive bladder hydration strategy addresses a behavioral dimension that runs parallel to the physiological ones, the trained voiding frequency that fluid restriction inadvertently produces. The detrusor muscle adapts to the pattern of frequent small volume voiding by generating urgency signals at progressively smaller fill volumes. The bladder learns to expect emptying at 150 milliliters because it has been consistently emptied at 150 milliliters for months. This learned pattern persists even when hydration is restored and urothelial irritation is reduced, because the detrusor's threshold for urgency signaling has been behaviorally reset downward. Bladder retraining, practiced concurrently with hydration optimization, gradually restores the bladder's tolerance for appropriate fill volumes. The protocol involves progressively extending the interval between voiding urges and actual voiding by 5 minutes each week. Research published in the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology found that bladder retraining combined with adequate hydration produced a 57% reduction in urgency episode frequency over 12 weeks. Optimal hydration reduces the urgency stimulus, making the behavioral retraining more manageable. The experience of discovering that fluid restriction is worsening rather than helping bladder symptoms carries a particular kind of relief. A 68-year-old retired teacher had been restricting her fluid intake for nearly 3 years in an effort to manage her symptoms. A study from the Continence Foundation of America, following 94 adults over 65 who had been self-restricting fluids for bladder symptoms, found that 71% showed improvement in symptom scores when fluid restriction was replaced with a structured hydration optimization protocol, with the average improvement in urgency severity scores reaching 41% at 8 weeks. The majority of these adults had been restricting fluids for more than 1 year. The improvement was available to them throughout that year. The information that would have delivered it simply had not reached them. A study from the Continence Foundation of America, following 94 adults over 65 who had been self-restricting fluids for bladder symptoms, found that 71% showed improvement in symptom scores when fluid restriction was replaced with a structured hydration optimization protocol, with the average improvement in urgency severity scores reaching 41% at 8 weeks. The majority of these adults had been restricting fluids for more than 1 year. The improvement was available to them throughout that year. The information that would have delivered it simply had not reached them. Here is the single most important truth from everything we have covered today. Your bladder does not improve when it receives less water. It deteriorates. Every mechanism points in the same direction, and that direction is opposite to what the advice you may have been following intends. The correct strategy is not restriction. It is optimization, 1.5 to 2 liters of daily fluid distributed to protect nighttime sleep. Elimination of caffeine, carbonation, and acidic beverages that deliver additional irritant burden. Adequate magnesium to support urothelial barrier integrity and cellular water retention, and concurrent bladder retraining to restore the fill tolerance that years of concentrated urine urgency have gradually eroded. Drinking more water is not the cause, it is the solution. It is never too late to start doing the thing the biology actually needs. The counterintuitive truth at the center of today's conversation points towards something larger. When we treat the symptom in a way that perpetuates the cause, we create the conditions that make it worse. What changes when the mechanism is understood is not just the strategy, it is the relationship with the body. Instead of managing an enemy with restriction, you are supporting a system with what it needs. That shift from adversarial management to informed support is what this information makes possible. Begin tomorrow morning with a full glass of water before anything else. Note how you feel. Commit to your daily target for 2 weeks before assessing what has changed. The biology needs adequate time and consistency to respond. If this conversation reversed an assumption you had been carrying, I genuinely want to hear about it in the comments below. Share this with someone whose bladder symptoms have been quietly shrinking their world. The solution may be simpler than you imagined. Subscribe and stay with this channel. There is more of this specific mechanism-based science of healthy aging waiting for you in the conversations ahead. I will see you in the next one.